The warning was carved in blood. Patrice Lumumba silenced in 67 days. Thomas Sankara gunned down before his dream could take root. Muammar Gaddafi dragged into the desert and executed while the world watched. The message was clear: challenge the West and die. Yet from the ashes of this brutal history rises a voice that refuses to be silenced. A young captain from a landlocked nation, Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, now stands where so many before him have fallen. At 34, he has turned the eyes of the world towards Ouagadougou, declaring that sovereignty is not a gift to be granted, but a birthright to be reclaimed. What happens when a forgotten nation dares to tear off the chains history forged for it? Can one of Africa's smallest countries ignite a fire that spreads across the continent? Or will the cycle of betrayal and blood repeat once more? Do not look away. What comes next may change how we read the map. Subscribe and walk with us. Burkina Faso was not always at the center of global headlines. For decades, it was spoken of only in passing. A small, landlocked state ranked near the bottom of every human development index. But beneath its soil lay gold, and above its ground spread the seeds of discontent. By the mid-2010s, the statistics painted a merciless picture. Over 60 tons of gold extracted annually. Yet ordinary Burkinabe lived on little life expectancy, barely above 60 years, and only a third of the population with access to clean water. It was a paradox: wealth leaving the earth, poverty clinging to the people. The rise of Ibrahim Traoré must be understood in this landscape. As a junior officer, he patrolled the troubled northern regions. He saw villages emptied by violence, schools abandoned, and markets turned to ashes. He watched French convoys rumble past to guard mines while communities buried their dead. What he learned early was simple and searing. Foreign powers valued Burkina Faso's gold more than its people. Then came the storm of terrorism. After the fall of Libya in 2011, weapons flooded into the Sahel, arming militants who struck with fury. In January 2016, the splendid hotel attack in Ouagadougou killed 30 people, a brutal sign that the war had arrived at the nation's doorstep. More attacks followed, spreading fear across towns and villages. By 2020, vast swaths of territory were lost to insurgents. Health clinics abandoned, teachers fled, and families crowded into displacement camps. The soil of Burkina Faso was soaked not only with gold dust, but with the grief of its people. The nation looked for leadership. President Roch-Marc Christian Kabore promised reform, following the international playbook of aid and partnership. Yet the more he aligned with foreign ambassadors, the more his people felt abandoned. By 2021, protests filled the streets, citizens accusing their government of listening more to Paris than to Ouagadougou. The state seemed paralyzed, its sovereignty traded for security advice and aid packages that solved nothing. In January 2022, the military stepped in. Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Damiba overthrew Kabore, vowing to restore dignity. At first, young officers like Traoré believed him. But 8 months later, nothing had changed. French advisors still dictated military strategy. Mining contracts still drained the country's wealth northward. Terrorist attacks still claimed lives each week. For Traoré, it was a grim déjà vu. New face, same strings. The breaking point came in late September 2022 during a military briefing. Damiba once again deferred to French advisors in front of his officers. That moment struck Traoré like a thunderbolt. If even a soldier who seized power could not break free of foreign control, what hope remained? That night, he gathered fellow officers, young men who had buried comrades and seen their people betrayed. Their conclusion was unanimous. Sovereignty would never be handed down, it had to be seized. On 30 September 2022, Ouagadougou awoke to gunfire and explosions. By dawn, the world saw a young captain on national television. His beret tilted, his eyes steady. Ibrahim Traoré declared the end of Damiba's rule. At 34, he became not only the youngest head of state in the world, but the embodiment of a new defiance. It was not just another coup in West Africa. It was the planting of a seed of resistance against the old order. Where others saw chaos, millions across the continent saw a rare harvest, dignity reclaimed, even if only for a moment. But this was only the beginning. The world quickly realized that Ibrahim Traoré was not following the usual script. Previous coups in Africa often began with promises of change and ended with quiet negotiations to reassure foreign capitals. But in his first weeks as head of state, Traoré signaled a different path. He spoke not to Paris, Washington, or Brussels, but directly to his people. He did not court foreign investors. He promised ordinary Burkinabe that their interests would come first. In December 2022, he delivered his boldest move, a request that French troops leave Burkina Faso entirely. For decades, French bases had stood as symbols of both security guarantees and lingering colonial dominance. Their presence reassured mining companies but reminded citizens that their sovereignty was conditional. By expelling them, Traore struck at the psychological core of neocolonialism. It was a declaration that African security would no longer be supervised by Europe. Western governments were stunned. Editorials in European newspapers warned of instability. Diplomats muttered about democratic backsliding. Sanctions were whispered about in Brussels. Yet on the streets of Ouagadougou, the reaction was electric. Crowds poured into public squares waving national flags, chanting his name. To them, it was not just a military order. It was dignity restored. The new government did not stop there. Mining contracts, long tilted towards foreign corporations, were reopened. Agreements that sent gold and profits northwards were renegotiated to ensure a larger share stayed in Burkina Faso. Processing plants were established to add value before export, breaking the old pattern of sending away raw resources only to buy back finished products at higher prices. International observers called these policies reckless. But in villages where schools had no chalk and clinics had no medicine, the message resonated. This was a leader who placed people before foreign partners. His speeches echoed with themes of pride, self-reliance, and a cultural rebirth. He invoked the ancestors who had built kingdoms before colonial borders, reminding citizens that dignity was not foreign-made, but homegrown. As expected, the vacuum left by France was soon filled. Russian military advisors arrived with equipment and training. Chinese firms bid for infrastructure projects long dominated by European companies. Iranian specialists brought agricultural expertise. Traoré defended these partnerships as pragmatic. Burkina Faso would work with any nation that respected its sovereignty. The era of exclusive ties dictated by colonial history was over. But every step he took was matched by a counterstep from the West. The European Union imposed sanctions on officials aligned with him. American think tanks warned of a contagion effect spreading across Africa. Western media reframed him not as a liberator, but as another African strongman hiding behind populist rhetoric. Headlines obsessed over human rights concerns, civilian transition delays, and security failures. They rarely mentioned the decades of foreign interference that had produced these very crises. Yet across Africa, his defiance inspired. In Mali, Colonel Assimi Goïta used similar language of sovereignty. In Niger, General Abdourahmane Chiani began questioning uranium deals with France. Together, these leaders formalized their cooperation in the Alliance of Sahel states, pooling intelligence, launching joint military operations, and discussing economic integration independent of former colonial powers. When ECOWAS threatened sanctions, the three countries did not bend. Instead, they accelerated plans to leave the organization altogether. To millions of young Africans disillusioned by decades of leaders bowing to foreign demands, this defiance was intoxicating. Here, finally, were leaders who said no and meant it. At Pan-African conferences, Traoré became the headline act. He received standing ovations for declaring, "We will reclaim our continent's destiny." His envoys pushed back against Western talking points at international forums, refusing to nod along politely. For Western diplomats, this was a nightmare scenario, a small country sparking a continental awakening. But with every cheer came a shadow of doubt. Expelling old powers and forging new ties was one thing. Delivering security and prosperity was another. Could one young captain carry both the burden of his nation and the hopes of a continent? The applause was loud, but so too were the questions. Revolutions rarely move in straight lines. For every cheer in Ouagadougou squares, there were whispers of grief in the countryside. The withdrawal of French troops left gaps in the nation's defenses. Russian advisors had arrived, but they were few, their equipment slow to integrate. In the north and east, militant groups seized the opportunity. Entire stretches of land fell outside government control. By 2024, the numbers were devastating. More than 2 million Burkinabe, nearly 1 in 10 citizens, had been displaced from their homes. Schools stayed closed, clinics turned dark, and whole communities abandoned centuries of life to seek refuge. The death toll rose with merciless speed. From 3,600 in 2022, the number of people killed by militant attacks surpassed 6,300 just 2 years later. Every week brought new funerals, new lists of names carved into memory. Supporters defended the revolution as a necessary storm, the pain before the harvest. Critics, both local and foreign, called it proof that Traoré's fiery words had not translated into real solutions. Economically, the break with neo-colonial dependency was proving just as harsh. International investors withdrew, fearing instability. Projects slowed as access to global finance dried up. Youth unemployment remained stubbornly high, feeding frustration among the very generation that had once lifted Traore on their shoulders. Skilled professionals, teachers, doctors, engineers, began leaving, not out of disloyalty, but because hope could not fill empty stomachs. The country was bleeding brains even as it tried to rebuild its backbone. Traore did not deny these problems. Instead, he reframed them. In speech after speech, he argued that breaking chains would always be painful. Dependence had become so normal that independence now felt like deprivation. He told his people that the revolution was not about instant prosperity, but about reclaiming dignity. Dignity that might cost dearly in the short term, but would yield sovereignty in the long. His message tapped into something deeper than economics. The conviction that anti-colonial Africa could no longer afford to trade liberty for convenience. Politically, the boldest decision came with his announcement that the transition back to civilian rule would not occur until 2029. To Western diplomats, this was proof of authoritarian ambition. To many Burkinabe, it was common sense. They had watched rushed elections in the past reinstall the same elites who bowed to foreign powers. They had seen fragile institutions crumble under external pressure. Traore argued that you cannot build a house while the ground beneath is shaking. Institutions must be strengthened before any vote could be meaningful. Still, the debate was fierce. Civil society groups demanded guarantees. Opposition figures accused him of clinging to power. International organizations issued stern reports about democratic backsliding. Yet in village gatherings and crowded marketplaces, ordinary people often replied with a shrug, "We have tried elections before. What did they give us? Poverty, insecurity, humiliation." The reality was complex. Traore was admired, but admiration did not keep families safe from militant raids. He was praised as a symbol of defiance, but symbols did not put food on the table. The revolution had ignited pride, but pride could not replace lost livelihoods. Every day, Burkinabe lived with this paradox, dignity reclaimed at the cost of daily survival. In many ways, this was the true test. Could a revolution rooted in sovereignty endure when the price was so high? Could young officers who marched to the sound of dignity deliver the bread and security their people demanded? Could the vision of an independence hold when bodies were still being buried and jobs still scarce? The revolution was proving costly, but could Africa afford not to pay? No revolution happens in isolation. From the moment Ibrahim Traoré appeared on national television in September 2022, the ripples reached far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Western governments watched with unease, regional blocs scrambled to respond, and African youth in distant capitals found themselves captivated by the unfolding drama. The African Union and ECOWAS were among the first to issue statements condemning the coup, demanding a rapid return to constitutional order. Threats of suspension and sanctions followed. Yet for every communique issued in Addis Ababa or Abuja, voices on the streets told a different story. In Bamako, Niamey, and Dakar, demonstrators carried portraits of Traoré, hailing him as the embodiment of resistance. The split between institutional diplomacy and popular sentiment was stark. European reactions were sharper still. The European Union imposed targeted sanctions on officials in Ouagadougou, and think tanks in Paris warned of a domino effect. Reports described Burkina Faso as a contagion zone, where anti-colonial sentiment was spreading like wildfire. Western media echoed these fears, reframing Traoré not as a reformer, but as an authoritarian bent on extending military rule. They rarely mentioned the decades of external interference that had weakened democratic institutions in the first place. The United States joined the chorus, quietly signaling that Traoré's growing influence posed risks to Washington's strategic interests in the Sahel. American officials spoke privately about containing the contagion before it reached larger, resource-rich states. To them, the danger was not only instability, but the possibility that other African nations might also reject the Western development model. But while the West sought to contain, a different narrative took hold across Africa. At Pan-African conferences, Traoré's speeches about dignity and independence drew standing ovations. He did not speak the cautious language of diplomacy, but the fiery rhetoric of a generation tired of waiting. "We will reclaim our continent's destiny," he declared, and young Africans from Senegal to Kenya believed him. The resonance was powerful because it touched a nerve that ran deeper than Burkina Faso alone. Mali's Assimi Goïta echoed his language of defiance. Niger's Abdourahmane Chiani questioned uranium deals and foreign military bases. Together, they formed the Alliance of Sahel States, signaling that this was not an isolated coup but part of a broader shift. For the first time in decades, African sovereignty was no longer a slogan, but a collective demand. The reaction abroad revealed a paradox. Every sanction, every stern report, every negative headline seemed only to confirm Traoré's message. Instead of weakening him, international condemnation reinforced his image as a man standing against global powers. To his supporters, it was proof that he was on the right side of history. Would the world accept a new voice from Africa or silence it once again? Every revolution reaches a crossroads. For Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré, that moment is now. The promises of dignity, sovereignty, and rebirth have ignited hope. Yet the weight of insecurity, economic strain, and isolation has pressed heavily on the nation. The path forward is uncertain, but it is also rich with possibility. One vision imagines a Burkina Faso that transforms its hardships into resilience. Mining contracts, rewritten to favor the people, could fund schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. Agricultural reforms may reduce dependence on imports, feeding the nation with its own harvest. Regional cooperation through the Alliance of Sahel States could create a shared front against terrorism, pooling resources and building economies less vulnerable to external manipulation. If successful, the country could become a living argument that African solutions are not only possible, but stronger than the imported models of the past. Another vision is darker. The continued rise of militant attacks, the slow pace of new alliances, and the economic isolation could grind down even the strongest will. A generation might lose faith if daily survival remains out of reach. Pride alone cannot substitute for bread, and dignity is fragile when weighed against hunger. If the revolution falters, its failure may be used as proof by skeptics who claim that Africa cannot stand without external guidance. Between these two futures lies a battlefield not only of guns and gold, but of perception. Traoré's greatest weapon has been his voice, a voice that speaks aloud what millions whisper. But even voices can fade if they are not matched by results. His challenge is not simply to resist the old order, but to construct a new one resilient enough to endure. The coming years will test whether this is merely another chapter in Africa's long struggle or the beginning of a turning point. Can Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation long considered peripheral, set an example for the entire continent? Can the revolution carry both dignity and development, sovereignty and security, pride and prosperity? History rarely waits for the hesitant. The choices made now will echo far beyond Ouagadougou, shaping the narrative of a continent that refuses to bow. History was watching, and history does not wait. From the blood-stained memories of Patrice Lumumba, to the silenced dreams of Thomas Sankara, to the desert execution of Muammar Gaddafi, Africa's story has long been written by the hands of others. Yet today, in the streets of Ouagadougou, another chapter is being written not with ink or chains, but with the fire of defiance. Ibrahim Traoré has become more than a soldier, more than a head of state. He is a symbol, fragile yet powerful, of a continent refusing to remain silent. The revolution unfolding in Burkina Faso is not only about one man or one nation, it is about the broader struggle of anti-colonial Africa, a struggle that spans generations. It is the call to reclaim dignity in the face of decades of dependency, the choice to endure hardship rather than surrender sovereignty, the belief that freedom must be lived, not granted. For millions across Africa, the young captain has voiced the whispers long carried in the wind, that this land has the right to chart its own future. But revolutions do not succeed on words alone. They must deliver security to mothers raising children in displacement camps. They must provide livelihoods to young people searching for more than survival. They must prove that African sovereignty is not a dream, but a lived reality. The road ahead is steep, filled with enemies seen and unseen, and yet it is a road that must be walked if dignity is to be more than a slogan. Perhaps the verdict is still out. Perhaps history will one day judge Traoré harshly, or perhaps it will remember him as the spark that lit a new dawn. What is clear is this: the fight for anti-colonial Africa is far from over, and its outcome will echo far beyond the Sahel. So I leave you with a question. Will this generation be remembered as the one that bent under pressure, or the one that finally stood tall? If this story stirs something within you, do not turn away. Subscribe, share, and let your voice join the chorus of a continent reclaiming its destiny.